Every healer in the Thornwall territories had given up. The Alpha King of the 7 bloodlines, the man who had unified the northern packs before his 40th year, who had broken 3 blood feuds through iron will and colder strategy, now lay motionless in the center of the keep's sealed healing chamber, surrounded by silent guards and the hollow rhythm of a breathing apparatus that counted down to his end. 18 days ago, 3 arrows had found him in a dawn ambush that shook every pack from the eastern ridge to the Salt Coast. Now there was no response, no recognition. His healers called it the void sleep, a state beyond unconsciousness where the mind had retreated so completely that not even pain could call it back. His second-in-command had already prepared the succession documents. The vultures were circling. Rival pack lords were quietly realigning loyalties, redistributing border agreements, testing the edges of territories that had been uncrossable for 12 years. Not a single soul who entered the healing chamber came out of love. Only calculation. Only greed. Only the cold arithmetic of what came next. But every night, a mending woman named Ren Aldara would slip into the chamber with her cart of salves and clean linens, and she would do something the healers called a waste of breath. She talked to him, not because she knew he was the Alpha King of the 7 bloodlines, not because she understood the empire of alliances and blood pacts that he had spent 20 years constructing. She talked to him because behind the old battle scars and the faded pack marks that covered his arms like a map of every war he had survived, she saw a human being. Ren was a ghost in Thornwall, an Omega mending woman and single mother drowning in debt, living in the margins of the settlement in a room that the wind found easily. She was one missed shift away from the street, carrying a weight that the world had simply decided was hers to carry. She told this silent stranger about her daughter Pip. She spoke of the way Pip laughed at thunder, convinced it was the sky clearing its throat. She described how Pip pressed her small nose against the frost-cracked window of their quarters every evening to find the first star. And deep inside the endless silence of the void, Sleep, the most dangerous alpha in 7 territories, was holding on to her voice like a rope in a flooding river. Ren's stories were the only lights keeping his soul from drifting into the permanent dark. Then came the night that defied every law known to pack healers. The night when Ren, desperate and with nowhere else to go, had to smuggle her feverish, crying toddler into the healing chamber. And in a moment of pure survival, she laid little Pip on the broad, scarred chest of the man the world had already mourned. What happened over the next few hours was not medicine. It was not logic. No healer in any of the 7 territories could explain the readings that followed. If this story doesn't move you, nothing will. Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one with the crown. It's the one who becomes a shield for a child. Edric Voss stood in the stone corridor outside the healing chamber, his shadow long against the torchlight, staring at the pack marks on the backs of his own hands. 18 days since the ambush. He could still smell the blood on the morning air of that ridge, could still see the exact angle of surprise on the Alpha King's face when the arrows came from the wrong direction. From behind the guard formation. From inside, Edric had known Cale Vane since they were both young enforcers in the southern docks of Mourne Hold. He remembered the day a young Cale had watched his own mentor be stripped of rank by the council, had watched without flinching, had filed the lessons somewhere behind those pale gray eyes and turned it into armor. He had never flinched since. Not when he climbed through the ranks through strategy and will. Not when he unified 3 feuding bloodlines through a combination of force and extraordinary patience. Not when he built a shadow of governance across the 7 territories that reached places no alpha had reached before. He had turned himself into something beyond a man. Precise, brilliant, untouchable. But now that precision was lying still. The ice alpha was fading, and the empire he had built was cracking with every silent day that passed behind that sealed door. Or so they thought. The wheels of Ren's linen cart squeaked against the stone floor of the healing wing, a mournful sound she had learned to time against the guard rotations, so it blended into the ambient noise of the keep at night. To everyone else, Ren Aldara was a shadow in a gray mending woman's apron, a figure whose existence was defined by the linens she changed and the salves she applied. She passed the guards at the chamber door without being truly seen. Their eyes were trained on threats, and Wren, with her tired face and the faint smell of chamomile and goat's milk that always clung to her from Pip's bedtime routine, registered as nothing more than furniture. She approached the bed slowly. Alpha King Cale Vane looked less like a man, and more like a monument that had been struck by lightning. His jaw was sharp, his dark hair still kept as though his body refused certain dignities even in its abandonment. It was the scars that always drew her attention, the old ones, layered over years, that told the history of every border skirmish and internal challenge she had only ever heard about in fragments. To the settlement, these marks meant terror. To Wren, they were just the map of a life she would never understand. "The wind came off the eastern ridge tonight," she said softly, settling into the routine that had developed over weeks without her quite deciding to develop it. She didn't call him my lord, or your majesty. In the dark of the night, they were just two people in the same room. Pip decided the wind is actually a very large dog. She spent an hour at the window barking back at it. She worked while she talked, changing the water in the basin, straightening the compress on his chest, moving through the small rituals of care with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this kind of quiet, unwitnessed work her entire life. "The Eastern provisioner came by again today," she said, her voice dropping. "He doesn't care that the hearth in our quarters hasn't drawn properly in a month. He wants his rent. I'm 3 shifts short this moon because Pip had that cough, and every time I look at the debt ledger I feel like the numbers are growing taller than I am." She paused, her hand hovering over the edge of the bed. "It's strange, isn't it? You're lying there with every resource in 7 territories and you can't draw a breath on your own. I've got all the breath in the world and I can't afford to live." She didn't touch him. She pulled back, but she stayed, leaning against the cool stone of the bedpost, letting her words fill the silence the way she had learned to fill silences, completely, without performance, because there was no audience. She told him about the one-eyed carved fox Pip slept with, about the taste of the thin barley soup she had made for their supper, about the invisible thread her mother used to describe, the one that runs between people who have nothing left to lose and somehow find each other anyway. In the depths of the void sleep, Cale Vane did not move. But for a single instant, the line on the healer's monitoring glass, the device the keep's master physician had constructed to track the pulse, gave a strange, subtle flutter. As though something inside the silent chamber had reached out to catch the sound of her voice before it could dissolve into the night air. Edric Voss moved through the corridor with the practiced ease of a man who belonged everywhere, and therefore questioned nowhere. His riding cloak was dark, his boots silent on the stone. The 2 guards straightened as he approached the chamber. He waved them down with the comfortable authority of the second-in-command, a man who had been given the interim seal the moment the Alpha King stopped breathing independently. He entered and pulled a chair to the bedside. To anyone watching through the observation slot, he looked like a loyal brother in arms, a man keeping vigil. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head bowed. But his eyes were open, sharp, predatory, tracing the shallow, mechanical rise and fall of Cale Vane's chest with the attention of someone reading a document they expect to be useful shortly. "You always did have a sense for the dramatic, Cale," Edric murmured, his voice pitched below the range of the guard's hearing. He reached out and adjusted the hem of the sleeping man's blanket, his fingers lingering near the healer's pulse cord. "But the world doesn't pause for theater. The northern trade routes are under my seal now. The Morn Hold Council has stopped sending ravens with your seal on them. They're sending mine." He leaned closer. "I brought you flowers." He said this louder, for the benefit of anyone passing. A large arrangement of white winter blooms had been placed on the stone shelf, the kind used for funerals. "The men ask after you every day." Then quieter, a whisper that barely moved the air. "But a king who can't hold a sword isn't a king. He's a memory. And I've always found the past inconvenient." He stood, smoothed his cloak with a precise snap. He looked down at Cale Vane, the man who had once been his mentor, his brother, the architect of everything Edric had ever benefited from, and he felt the old fear for just a moment, the memory of how that pale gray gaze could stop a man mid-motion. He pushed it down, replaced it with the cool clarity of what came next. He had 36 hours before the succession documents became irrevocable. The accident with the heating brazier in the chamber had already been arranged. The keep's backup fire system would fail to respond briefly. Briefly was enough. He walked out without looking back. He didn't see the single line of moisture that had escaped the corner of Kaelvain's closed eye. Not grief. The slow, burning fury of a man trapped behind his own silence, listening to his world be sold by the person he had trusted most. The cold that came off the eastern ridge at night didn't just settle, it accumulated, pressing into the cracks of the settlement's outer buildings, finding every gap in old mortar and loose shutter. For Wren, the world had begun to fracture in the specific way it fractures when you have been holding it together alone for too long, and one more thing gives way. She sat in the corner of her cramped quarters, holding Pip against her chest, feeling the terrifying heat radiating from the toddler's skin. Pip's breathing was ragged, short, labored pulls of air that sounded all wrong. Every few minutes she whimpered, a small, broken sound that went straight through Wren's chest like a splinter. Wren had gone to the settlement's healer that morning. The fee alone had been more than she earned in a week. When she had tried to negotiate, offered to work it off in mending shifts, offered anything, the healer's assistant had looked through her the way people looked through her everywhere, except the chamber on the upper floor. Then her shift supervisor at the provisioners had sent word. If she missed another morning to tend a sick child, she shouldn't bother returning. The debt ledger had absorbed that income before she'd even processed losing it. By midnight, Pip's fever had climbed to the place that made Wren's vision blur with a terror she had no words for. The child's face was flushed and damp, her eyes glassy, her small body twisting in Wren's arms with the restless urgency of something fighting, something it couldn't name. Desperation strips away everything except the next step. It is not dramatic. It is very quiet. It is the particular silence of a person who has run out of options and is now simply choosing between them. Wren wrapped Pip in every spare blanket, tucked her into the worn carrier she'd had since Pip was an infant, stepped into the cold. The keep's healing wing had a service entrance on the east side. She had used it every night for months. She knew the timing of the guard rotations. She knew which stones of the corridor floor didn't echo. She moved like water finding the lowest path, through the loading passage and up the back stair, carrying her daughter against her heart, and praying to whatever thread connected the helpless to the helped. The upper floor was warm. The healing chamber was warmer still, kept that way by the thermal stones used for circulation work in patients who couldn't move themselves, and the man on the bed didn't ask for rent. The chamber door clicked shut behind her, and Wren stood in the dim blue glow of the monitoring glass, holding her breath. The two guards outside were indifferent to the mending woman. They had never been otherwise. "I'm sorry," Wren whispered into the stillness. The room absorbed it. "I have nowhere else to go. Please, just for tonight." She settled into the small chair beside the bed, but Pip would not quiet. The fever had made the child's skin sensitive. She twisted in Wren's arms, her small body fighting its own heat, and the sounds she was making were the sounds that drew attention. Loud, desperate, the kind that carried through stone walls. If a night healer heard a child's cry from the Alpha King's sealed chamber, Wren would be gone within minutes, and Pip would be back in the cold. Wren looked at the wide, still expanse of Kaelvain's chest. The thermal blankets had kept him warm. He lay motionless, as he always lay, the faded pack marks of his bloodline running up his arms and disappearing beneath the collar of his healing gown, and his chest rose and fell with the assisted rhythm of the breathing apparatus. It was not a rational decision. It was a survival decision. Those are different things. With trembling hands, Wren stood and carefully lowered Pip into the space between the Alpha King's arm and his side. She tucked the toddler into the curve of his shoulder, Pip's small dark head resting directly over the spot where his heart kept its weak, mechanical time. The silence that followed was immediate. Pip's ragged breathing began to smooth. The rhythmic assist of the breathing apparatus, steady and slow, seemed to reach her at some level below consciousness. A heartbeat to anchor to, a chest rising and falling in a pattern the child's body could follow. Her tiny hand reached out, fingers curling into the fabric of the healing gown, holding on. As the child's fever warmth seeped through the blanket and into the still man beneath it, the monitoring glass beside the bed made a sound it had not made in 18 days. Not a flat line, not a mechanical beat, a spike. A sudden flare of activity in the glass that made Wren press both hands over her mouth. Then the door burst open. The night healers came in with the focused efficiency of people expecting a crisis. They had seen the monitoring glass from the corridor station. They were expecting the specific crisis of a body finally releasing its last grip on life. They were not expecting what they found. The lead healer began, then stopped. Because Cale Vane's hand, the right hand, the scarred one, the one the healers had said would not move again, had risen from the blankets and wrapped itself around the arm of the healer who was reaching to remove Pip from his chest. It did not tremble. It locked. The grip of a man who has been away for a very long time and has found the one thing he is not letting go of. The machines screamed. The monitoring glass erupted in patterns the healers would spend days trying to document. The breathing apparatus which had been doing all the work began to detect the interference of a set of lungs that were attempting, improbably and against every expectation, to help. Cale Vane turned his head, his eyes opened. Not cloudy, not vacant. Not the confused emergence of someone drifting back from fever. Clear. Burning with the specific, terrifying clarity of someone who has been present, entirely, helplessly present, for everything they were not supposed to hear, and who has just been given back the ability to respond. He did not look at the healers. He did not look at the monitoring glass, or the breathing apparatus, or the faces crowded in the doorway. He looked down at the small head resting on his heart, and his grip on the healer's arm said everything that his ruined 18-day silent voice could not yet form. Don't. The healer held very still. The room held very still. Wren collapsed against the far wall with both hands over her mouth, was making no sound at all. "Mr." the lead healer began. The title of address for the Alpha King was a sound none of them had expected to use again. "Your Majesty, the child is febrile. She needs mine." The word came out as a sound like old stone shifting, a voice that had not been used in 18 days, that had been present in every conversation in this room for 18 days without being able to participate, that had heard Edric Voss lean over and whisper about succession documents and sealed trade routes and a death arranged for convenience. One word. His eyes fixed on Wren across the room. Mine, not the child. Mine, as though he were claiming the only honest thing that had come into this room in 3 weeks. The only voice that had spoken to him without calculation. The only presence that had seen a human being where everyone else had begun to see an inconvenient obstacle to the next arrangement of power. Wren stepped forward. Her legs were not entirely reliable. She stopped at the edge of the bed, looking at the man who had been still as carved stone for 18 days, and was now looking at her with eyes that were devastatingly, frighteningly awake. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I had nowhere." "Don't." His voice was gravel and rust. He released the healer's arm. His hand moved, slowly, with the effort of muscles that had been motionless for 18 days, and it came to rest on the blanket covering Pip's small back. Not pushing her away, shielding her. He looked at the crowded doorway, the healers, the night guards, the curious faces of those who had been summoned by the monitoring glass, screaming its impossible news. "Out," he said. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The chamber emptied. The lead healer stayed, professional obligation overriding instinct, and she stayed at the far side of the room, monitoring the glass with shaking hands and the expression of someone who had studied the void sleep for 20 years and was watching it become something her education had never accounted for. In the quiet that followed, Cale Vane breathed, on his own, slowly, painfully, with the full effort of chest muscles that had forgotten the habit, but on his own. Pip had slipped into the deep, quiet sleep of a fever finally breaking, her small chest rising and falling in the regular rhythm of genuine rest, the kind that came after the fight was done. Wren sat in the chair beside the bed. She did not speak. She did not know how to begin. It was Cale who broke the silence. "The rain," he said. His voice was steadier now, still broken, still rough, but steadier. "You told me about the rain, that your daughter thought the thunder was the sky." Clearing its throat, Wren finished. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "She's been convinced of it for 2 months. He looked at her with those pale gray eyes. 18 days of silence. 18 days of lying still while his world was redistributed around him. 18 days of being present for every betrayal and every scheming calculation and every false performance of grief, with no ability to respond. And every night, one voice that had spoken to him like he was still a person. "You talk to me," he said. "You were here," she said. "Someone should." Something moved in his expression that was not the cold precision she had heard described in every account of the Alpha King ever given in the settlement. Something that was considerably older than precision and considerably more honest. "Why are you," he began. "Mending woman. Lower quarters. East side." She answered before he could finish, not to be dismissive, but because she had long ago learned to deliver that information quickly, to get ahead of the reassessment that always followed when people realized what she was. "I do the Healing Wings night linens. I shouldn't be here with my daughter. I know that. I'll stay." The word came out with the same flat certainty he had used on the healer reaching for Pip. No argument in it. No question. Just the word. Wren stayed. The night passed in fragments. The lead healer checked Kale's vital signs every hour, her documentation expanding with every reading into something that would eventually become one of the most studied accounts in pack healer history. His recovery was not the slow, incremental return she would have predicted. It was rapid in some areas and painful in others, and it had the quality of something that had been waiting for a specific condition to be met before it would begin. Pip's fever broke completely before dawn. She slept deeply, peacefully, tucked into a crib that one of the healers had quietly brought in, positioned close against the bed. Cale Vane lay awake through most of the night. He did not speak much. The effort was still significant, but his eyes were open, following the room, cataloging, recalibrating. The pale gray gaze that had been described in 100 accounts as cold turned out, at close range, to be something more complicated than cold. It was careful. The gaze of a man who had learned to hold everything at distance because everything he had let close had eventually been used as leverage against him. Everything except an Omega mending woman who hadn't known who he was. When the first gray light of pre-dawn came through the narrow window, Wren said quietly, "He's going to come again." Cale looked at her. "Edric Voss." She said the name plainly. She had heard it enough in the corridor outside this room, heard. It attached to the sounds of rearranged authority. "He's been preparing for you to be gone. When he learns you're not." "I know what he'll do," Cale said. She looked at him. "Do you have people who are still yours?" A pause. The question, and the fact that it was being asked by a mending woman with a sleeping toddler and no visible stake in the political outcome, seemed to reach him as something he hadn't expected. "Yes," he said. "If the word can get to them before Edric controls the morning. The keep has a servant's passage that runs to the outer stable. The night groom knows every rider in the settlement." She met his gaze steadily. "I've been using it to move linens for 3 years. No one watches it because no one watches the people who use it." He stared at her. She waited. "The riders I need," he said slowly. "I'll give you the names. And the pack seal phrase that will tell them the word is real." "Tell me," she said. He told her. She was gone for 20 minutes and back before the first shift change, settling quietly into the chair with the particular self-contained calm of someone who has completed a task and is now simply present. Cale watched her sit down. "You could have run," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "The settlement is full of people who would pay for information about what happened in this room tonight." "Yes," she agreed again, without any particular emphasis. "Why didn't you?" Wren looked at her daughter sleeping in the crib. "Because I spent 3 weeks talking to a person," she said. "Not a king, not an empire. A person, and I don't trade in people." She said it simply, without performance, the way she said everything, as though the true thing and the said thing were naturally the same, and she saw no reason they would ever be otherwise. The pale gray eyes that had been described as cold held hers for a long moment. "When this is over," Cale said, "there are debts I owe. You owe me nothing." "I owe you 18 days of honest conversation," he said. "In my experience, that is the rarest currency in 7 territories." They came at the second hour past midnight. Edric Voss's men moved through the healing wing with the quiet efficiency of people who had been told the job was straightforward. The Alpha King was a technicality. The monitoring glass would show a final line. The heating braziers would fail briefly, as arranged. It would be clean. Inside the chamber, the only light was the soft pulse of the monitoring glass. Wren sat in the armchair, her head tilted toward Pip's crib, deep in exhausted sleep. She did not hear the door. Cale heard everything. He lay with his eyes closed and his breathing deliberately measured, the practiced stillness of a man who had spent decades learning that the most information was gathered before the other person knew they were being observed. The lead man entered. His eyes went to the monitoring glass, calculating the specific series of actions he had been paid to take. He didn't find a fading body. He found a pair of open eyes, pale gray, fully awake, watching him with the particular calm of a man who has been waiting. The lead man stopped. His hand, which had been moving toward the breathing apparatus, went still. Cale's gaze moved from the lead man to the 2 behind him, and back. He did not reach for anything. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked. And the lead man, who had been told the king was dead, found himself standing in front of something that was so comprehensively and undeniably not dead that all the preparation for this moment became irrelevant in an instant. "Close the door," Cale said. His voice had recovered through the night to something considerably past a rasp. "Quietly. My daughter is sleeping." The words "my daughter" stopped every person in the room. The lead man looked at the crib, at the sleeping toddler, at the massive scarred hand that had come to rest on the crib's railing, not gripping it, not threatening. Simply there. Simply placed between whatever these men intended and the small, sleeping thing that was not going to be disturbed by it. "Tell Edric Voss," Cale said, "that the debt between us has changed. I am no longer interested in punishment. I am interested in one thing only, that the woman and child in this room are never within his reach. If that line is crossed, by him, by anyone sent by him, by anyone who stands to benefit from his succession, I will spend every resource I have on a single response, and it will not be a response he will find proportionate." He looked at the lead man with the calm, direct attention of someone stating a fact rather than making a threat. "He sent you to bury a dead man," Cale said. "You have found a living one. I suggest you consider which of those 2 situations is more useful to survive." The men withdrew. They did not run. Running would have required panic, and what they felt was not precisely panic. It was the specific, cold rearrangement of a worldview that had been built on the assumption that a certain man was no longer a factor. The door clicked shut. Wren stirred in her chair but didn't wake. Cale looked at her sleeping face. Then at Pip. He had spent 40 years building an empire on the principle that nothing personal survived in the world of power. That attachment was vulnerability. That the only durable currency was force and the careful management of fear. In 18 days of silence, a mending woman with a sick toddler and 3 weeks of debt had rendered that principle completely irrelevant. He had not changed his mind. His mind had been changed for him, by something considerably less interested in his opinions than he was accustomed to. He looked at the monitoring glass, still showing the hurricane of brain activity that the healers couldn't explain. He breathed, on his own. 6 months later, the heating in the lower quarters of Thornwall Keep had been completely overhauled. The debt ledgers of 11 Omega Mending workers had been quietly zeroed. 3 healing stations had been established in the outer settlement, the ones where mothers had been taking their children to doorsteps because there was nowhere else to go. No one was turned away for lack of payment. No one was invisible to the ledger that mattered. In a set of sun-warmed quarters overlooking the riverbend, Cale Vane sat on the floor. Not at a council table, not behind a seal desk. On the floor, on a woven rug, with his back against the wall and his long legs crossed, because Pip had decided that was where they were sitting today, and he had found some months ago that Pip's decisions were considerably more final than most of the council directives he had issued in his career. She stood in front of him now, studying his arm with the focused attention of a child who has found something interesting. He started to pull his sleeve down, the old reflex, the one that had kept the pack marks and the old battle scars covered in social settings. The learned understanding that his history was a thing that frightened people, and should be managed accordingly. Pip caught his wrist, her small fingers traced the oldest scar first, the one from the Morn Hold challenge, 20 years ago. Then the pack mark of the first bloodline he had unified, pressed into the skin by the old ceremony. She patted it. "Pretty," she announced, the verdict of an authority who had no interest in the history attached to the evidence. Cale looked at her. Something behind his eyes shifted. The last of what had been called the cold precision, the ice, the untouchable quality that the settlement attributed to him like a title. It did not melt so much as become something else, became present, became here. He was looking at a child who saw no blood in the marks of his life, who saw the man who had held her when the world was cold, and whose chest she had learned to find without looking. He looked up. Ren was standing in the doorway. Between the three of them, the air held the particular quality she had once described to a still man in a monitored chamber, the invisible thread, the one her mother had spoken of, the one that ran between people who had nothing left to lose and had somehow, through some combination of desperation and grace, and the specific courage of people who keep showing up anyway, found each other. "The council met this morning," Cale said. "Edric's redistribution has been fully unwound. The border agreements are restored. The pack lords who realigned are being brought back to the original terms. And Edric? Exile. Eastern Territories. Past the Salt Coast. He won't come back." Ren nodded. She came and sat beside him on the floor, her shoulder against his, the ordinary, comfortable proximity of two people who have stopped performing the distance. They watched Pip, who had moved on from the scars to attempting to have a detailed conversation with the carved fox she carried everywhere, apparently, informing it of the scar situation and its assessment. "She told the fox it was pretty," Cale said. "She tells the fox everything," Ren said. "The fox has opinions." "Apparently." The sun came through the window at the angle it came through at this hour, laying itself across the floor in a long, warm rectangle that Pip walked into and stopped, turning her face up to it with the complete, uncomplicated satisfaction of a creature that has found exactly what it needed. Cale watched her. He had spent 40 years believing that the most powerful position in any room was the one with the most leverage, the most information, the most force, the most carefully managed advantage. He had built an empire on that belief. He had been very good at it. He had been wrong. Not about the strategy. The strategy had worked. About what it was for. "I want to tell you something," he said. Ren turned to look at him. "I heard every word you said to me," he said. "For 18 days. Every story. Every debt. Everything about the landlord and the provisioner, and the cracked window, and the first star." He looked at her steadily. "I couldn't respond. I couldn't move. But I heard all of it, and it was—" He stopped. Cale Vane, who had addressed pack councils and settled blood feuds, and negotiated with lords who had more leverage than sense, stopped because the word he was reaching for was not a political word, and he had spent 40 years not needing the other kind. "It was the only honest thing I had," he said finally. "In a room full of people performing grief and calculating succession, you were the only real thing." Ren was quiet. "You were talking to a person," he said, "not a king." "You were a person," she said simply. "Someone should have said so." He looked at her for a long moment. "I would like to keep hearing you talk," he said, "for considerably longer than 18 days. It was not a grand declaration. It had no ceremony in it. It was the same flat, direct delivery he used for everything, for council decisions and border negotiations, and telling Edric Voss's men to close the door quietly because a child was sleeping. Ren looked at him. Then she looked at Pip, who had sat down in her rectangle of sunlight and was now telling the fox about it in considerable detail. Then she looked back at Kale. "All right," she said. 2 words. The same 2 words that started everything, really. A mending woman in a dim chamber saying it rained again today, to a man the world had already mourned. And somewhere in the dark, a king holding on. The thread was real. Wren's mother had been right. It ran between people who had been reduced to their essentials, stripped of pretense and strategy, and the careful performance of being something other than afraid. And it held, not because it was strong in the way chains are strong, but because it was honest in the way that few things ever manage to be. It ran between a mending woman who talked to still people because they deserved to be talked to, and a king who had spent 40 years becoming untouchable and had been undone in 18 days by a voice that simply refused to let him be nothing. It ran through a toddler who patted scars and called them pretty, and who had no patience for the idea that warmth belonged only to certain chests. And it held. That is how it works sometimes. Not in declarations. Not in the architecture of power. In a voice in the dark. In a child's hand on a scar. In someone who sees the person behind everything the world has decided to call them. Small things. Carrying forward. Becoming everything.